Good morning. Good morning. I call the committee to order. Pursuant to Committee Rule 5F, House Rule 11-2H4, the chair may postpone further proceedings today on any question of approving any measure or matter, adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote of the ayes and nays are orders, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. So ordered. Today, the committee will consider H.R. 2440, full utilization of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund Act, H.R. 1984, the Disaster Act, and H.R. 2502, Transparency in Federal Building Projects Act of 2019, and General Services Administration Capital Investment Leasing Program resolutions. Given competing hearings obligations for members this morning, my hope is to move these measures quickly. We would first consider H.R. 2440, the full utilization of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund Act. I now call up H.R. 2440, ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment from further consideration of H.R. 2440, and to be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. This has been an issue that's been before this committee. This will be the third time, and it's in slightly different form, but it has passed out of committee unanimously in two previous Congresses, but was removed by the Rules Committee from the Water Resources Development Act before consideration on the floor. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimates we will need an additional $15.8 billion between now and 2020 to meet the growing demand for the post-Panamax ships. And the harbor maintenance tax would provide adequate revenues to do that if we spend the full amount of income each year, and if we begin to access and prudently spend down the accumulated balance somewhere in the Treasury. This bill is quite simple. It'll provide a discretionary cap adjustment that will allow for full utilization of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund for the intended purposes of adequately maintaining our harbors of all sizes, as well as critical infrastructure such as breakwaters, jetties associated with those ports. We would spend the money, on an annual basis, the full, as I said before, the full income and the accumulated balance. So this would add up to $34 billion over the next decade. The industry has strongly supported this tax. It was essentially self-help. When they supported, the shippers supported the idea of imposing this minuscule ad valorem tax. Consumers benefit, the shipping industry benefits, America benefits by having our ports be efficient on a daily basis. Our 58 largest ports have about 40% of capacity, authorized capacity. So this is a long overdue investment from this committee, and I've always objected to the idea that we are collecting a tax for a specific purpose and yet somehow diverting or spending the money elsewhere or using it as an illusory deficit offset. It would be much better spent for its intended purpose, and this legislation would guarantee that. Without objection, I'd like to enter into the record several letters of support of this legislation from a broad array of ports, too long to list, and industries and shipping interests. And I would now recognize Subcommittee Chair Napolitano to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for your continued leadership on this issue in introducing of 2440, the full utilization of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund Act. And I want to, of course, thank Ranking Member Graves, Ranking Member Westerman, and Congressman Kelly for joining us as original co-sponsors. 2440 authorizes a discretionary cap adjustment for the full utilization of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund by the Army Corps of Engineers. This would enable the investment of approximately $34 billion over the next decade for the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund for its intended purpose of maintaining federally authorized harbors. This will allow the Corps to dredge all federal harbors to their constructed width and depth. In 1986, Congress enacted the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund as a user fee by taxing importers and domestic shippers at our harbors in order to pay for the maintenance of those harbors. The problem is that the trust fund collects more revenue than the president's budget requests, and Congress has appropriated the extra funding to maintain our harbors. According to the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund will collect an additional $24.5 billion in new revenue over the next decade, but federal appropriations from the trust fund will only be $19.4 billion. This discrepancy is in addition to the estimated $9.3 billion in previously collected but unspent revenue. During the subcommittee hearing on April 10th, representatives from ports, both big and small, all of them unanimously agreed that Congress must fully spend the trust fund on harbor needs. 2440 would provide the authority to spend all of the $24.5 billion in new revenue and, or I should say, plus the existing 9.3 balance as intended on harbor maintenance. As we pass this responsible budget bill today, I look forward to working with my colleagues as we move forward with the Water Resources Development Act, this Congress, to address inequities in how these funds are spent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and now I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know this legislation is a top priority for you, and I appreciate you working with our side to make this product something that the committee can be proud of and bipartisan. America's ports and harbors are vital to the entire economy, and they are an integral part of our cohesive national infrastructure system. Farmers, manufacturers, businesses across the country, whether they're near the coast or not, they rely on the ports for our trade. And every day, most Americans buy something that has traveled through a port at some time. This bill ensures that billions of additional funds already collected to improve our ports and harbors are invested for their intended purpose without raising a single dime of new taxes. And this is going to make the transportation system more efficient, and it's going to help keep the cost of goods lower for everyone. There's going to be many opportunities in this Congress to address this issue, including through the regular WRDA process or in a large budget agreement. But I look forward to working with you and all of my colleagues to accomplish our shared goal of full utilization of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. With that, I'd urge all members to support H.R. 2440.
I thank the gentleman, and I would now recognize Ranking Member Westerman for a statement.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio. H.R. 2440 does ensure that the Harbor Maintenance Fund is used for its intended purpose, and that is to maintain our federally authorized harbors. This bipartisan bill was introduced by Chairman DeFazio, who has long been a champion of this issue. The problem is simple. On top of the fact that our harbors desperately need maintenance, the trust fund collects more revenue from shippers than Congress has appropriated to the Corps of Engineers to maintain our harbors. Approximately $9.3 billion in already collected revenue is enough to address the nation's harbor maintenance backlog, but it sits idle. This bill would enable money collected for dredging and maintaining our ports and harbors to be fully spent for those purposes. Doing so means that ports are kept to their authorized widths and depths and ensures the global competitiveness of the American economy through the efficient use of our marine transportation system. I want to thank my fellow co-sponsors for championing this issue. Again, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Sam Graves, Subcommittee Chair Napolitano, and Representative Kelly. I urge all members to support H.R. 2440, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, gentlemen. Any other members wish to be recognized for statements on the legislation before the committee?
Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Representative Graves? Oh, wait a minute. Someone? Oh, okay. Oh, yes. Go right ahead. Sorry. That was his voice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Knowing full well the chairman's desire to actually fully deploy this money, and certainly knowing full well the ranking member's willingness to make sure that our harbors are in good shape, I reluctantly voice opposition to this particular bill. Candidly, while the money is collected for this distinct purpose, The problem is the appropriators. The appropriators, even this year, could have appropriated the full amount that was asked for by the Army Corps of Engineers and chose not to do so. This bill is nothing more than getting rid of non-defense discretionary caps. And so what it's going to do, every vote in favor of this is actually increasing non-defense discretionary money. And in a time when we have a $22 trillion plus deficit, I find it just fiscally irresponsible to suggest that this is the way that we should take this on. What further complicates things is that there are over 1,000 different accounts exactly like the Harbor Trust Fund, where we collect fees and other things. And if all of those accounts were handled in the same way, we would essentially be increasing non-defense discretionary spending by 20, 30, 40 billion dollars. And so while our ports and harbors are critical, I can tell you there are a number of members here who would have other areas that have dedicated funds just like this that they would want pulled out of the discretionary caps. And Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, when we look at this particular issue, I think there are ways that even I am willing to try to help accomplish the intended purpose, but just to remove a discretionary cap is certainly not a vote that I want to cast, and I would encourage my colleagues to think seriously before we do that. There are monies out there. We spent $700,000 on mariachi bands. We spend $1.7 billion on empty buildings that are under the jurisdiction of this very committee. There's monies there that we can move around, but more importantly, we need to get on the phone and talk to the appropriators and make this a priority instead of just trying to make this a mandatory spending program and relinquish the discretionary spending caps. And so for that reason, I would urge my colleagues to oppose this resolution.
I thank the gentleman. Just in brief response, I agree that, and we are going to be looking at GSA reform. I've long been critical of the operation of that agency, and I think there are savings to be had there and in other accounts over which we have jurisdiction. But in this case, we are taxing the American people specifically at the request of Ronald Reagan and the United States Congress for harbor maintenance in which we are in deficit. And we're not spending the money, and the appropriators cannot touch the accumulated balance of over $9 billion, which has been diverted by both Republican and Democratic administrations over the years. And, you know, we are losing our competitive edge. We're going to lose, our harbors. We will not be, like we are falling behind in so many other areas of transportation, we will not be a world leader. And as a maritime nation, I think that's very problematic. With that, I would recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I fully support H.R. 2440 and commend you and Chairwoman Napolitano for your leadership on this issue. As founder and chair of the Florida Ports Caucus, I know the vital role that ports play in sustaining a robust national economy and boosting local communities. Maritime cargo and cruise activities at Florida ports support nearly 900,000 well-paying jobs and generates $117 billion in economic activity. To ensure that Florida's ports and others throughout the nation can continue to serve as economic engines, we must authorize full utilization of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. When I met with port directors at the Florida Ports Caucus meeting that I hosted in March, they underscored the importance of full utilization to address more than $3 billion in construction and maintenance needs over the next 5 years. That's why I'm pleased to support H.R. 2440, which will ensure adequate funding to maintain our ports, promote our global competitiveness, and honor our long-standing commitment to American shippers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
in order given to me by the staff list. Representative Gibbs would be next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this because I think the Howard Maintenance Trust Fund has the word trust in there. And it's dedicated, the money should go for what it's supposed to go to. That's why it's called a trust fund. And so I'm not disagreeing. There's an issue for my colleague from North Carolina, and I think that's a part of the game that's played here in Washington. We don't want to beat the budget caps, but the appropriators need to address that a different way. But the money that's appropriated, it's taxed, our shippers, our customers are paying for it should go in the trust fund and remain in the trust fund and used where it's supposed to be for the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. On another note, Mr. Chairman, since this is our first meeting in our new refurbished committee room, I think the sound system so far is a lot better. I can actually hear really well. And I just have one concern. I'm a little disappointed. We had on the wall up there, previous Congress, the responsibilities, the constitutional responsibilities of this committee. I hope, Mr. Chairman, that those who that is put back up there. I think it's appropriate that just to remind members of the committee what our responsibilities, our constitutional responsibilities are that's spelled out in the Constitution. We might be one of the few committees that actually have specific language in the Constitution where our responsibilities are. So I hope that maybe that would be put back on there. But congratulations, Mr. Chairman, in the new committee room. It sounds pretty good to me. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I would say that the architect of the Capitol and his staff did do an excellent job in refurbishing, and we'll take under advisement what we might post on that now pristine wall. You know, I fully intend to bring back Article 1 projects if we move forward on a surface transportation bill, you know, being our authority under the Constitution, post roads and power of the purse. So there are many great quotes I think we could put up there that go to our charge. I thank the gentleman, and with that, I recognize Representative Lowenthal.
Thank you, Chair DeFazio and Subcommittee Chair Napolitano, for your hard work on this legislation. This bill is an important first step to addressing the substantial budget issues we reportedly run into as we work to modernize our ports and harbors. I'm glad that this committee is acting within our first 6 months to address this glaring problem. As Chair DeFazio has mentioned, for years, money collected for harbor maintenance has been diverted for other activities or used to paper over holes in budget math. It's far past the time that we right this wrong and ensure that the money is spent on needed and intended purposes, maintaining our ports and harbors. But I also want to echo the comments made by Chair Napolitano. As we work today to unlock the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund resources, this Congress and this committee must commit to addressing larger inequities in the allocation of these funds, and we must do that in the next Water Resources Development Act. These inequities play out across the country, but they're particularly acute in my region. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach drive the American economy, handling over a third of our imports and exports. They collect nearly $380 million in harbor maintenance taxes each year, but they receive less than 1.5% of these funds and coming back to them to pay for the needed water infrastructure improvements. I hope to work with Chair Napolitano and members on both sides of the aisle to address these inequities and make positive reforms to harbor maintenance that will enhance the productivity of our entire port and maritime transportation system. And I suggest that we use the American Association of Port Authorities industry-wide agreement as a starting point to enact these reforms. This agreement allows for donor and energy transfer ports to fund their own needed improvements, while also ensuring that all ports receive the resources they need for operations and maintenance. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I assure him that, and what I have said to the ports for years is let us get the funds, and then we will come up with a fair apportionment in the Water Resources Development Act, which we will do later this year. With that, I would recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Garrett Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, a lot's been said about this bill, and quite frankly, I agree with everybody. I agree with Mr. Meadows that the problem is with the appropriators. I agree that we do need to figure out how to not just come in, blow budget caps, and spend billions of dollars in additional discretionary funds as a result of enacting this legislation. But I also agree with the intent of this legislation. And let's be clear on what this is. I said this in this committee last Congress, I'm going to say it again. We are charging shippers a tax with the understanding that this is being charged for the purpose of dredging, for the purpose of providing navigation channels that are truly navigable. These funds are then being diverted for other government purposes. Look, let's call this what it is. This is embezzling. If you're doing this in the private sector, this is embezzling. You're charging money, you're taking money out of the auspice of doing something, but then you're doing something else with it. I mean, think about personally if you cut a check to your mortgage company and they send you a letter back and say, hey, you owe me another $1,000, and you're like, well, wait a minute, I sent you a check. Yeah, we took that and we went to dinner. Well, wait, what? You charged me money for a purpose, and then you're diverting it. So I think this legislation is actually restores integrity. I think it's the right legislation, it's the right policy to restore integrity, to do with the money what's intended to do. But I want to go back to what Mr. Meadows said. We should not just enact this bill and ignore the fact of the budget consequences that are out there. The reality is that a large portion of these funds, and I think, Mr. Chairman, we're around $10 billion at least in a Treasury receipt account, a paper balance of this account that's been stolen or diverted for other government purposes. We should not just do this bill and forget about the budgetary impacts. He is exactly right. We do need to pair this with the efforts in the Appropriations Committee to ensure we're not just blowing the budget caps here. If there are other government functions that need to be funded, we need to look and figure out how to exercise them to some discretion and truly prioritize. But I think that largely needs to be done within the venue of the Appropriations Committee. Last thing on this, in regard to the objectives of this bill. As we're seeing our economy grow, as we're seeing changes in shipping trends through wider and deeper vessels coming through the Panama Canal, the United States has not kept pace with these shipping trends internationally. I've traveled to ports around the world. I've seen what they've done. I've seen how they have prepared for these new shipping trends. And I want to be clear, prepared. They were ready ahead of time. The United States is trying to catch up. This is slowing our economy. It is costing more money because we're having to use more ships, smaller ships in some of our ports. We have one of the best maritime transportation systems in the nation. But if we don't have if we're not keeping up with shipping trends, those efficiencies that allow American workers, American companies to compete on global playing field is being undermined by this. And so I do support this bill. I urge adoption because I think this bill restores integrity. But I'm going to say one last time, I'm going to work with Mr. Meadows in the appropriations process to make sure that we don't just do this and blow budget caps. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Are there any amendments to H.R. 2440? Hearing none, if there are none, the question is on the adoption favorably reporting H.R. 2440 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. With that, we'd move on to H.R. 1984, the Disaster Act. Our second item of the day. I now call up H.R. 1984, asking unanimous consent to discharge Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management from further consideration of H.R. 1984, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I support H.R. 1984, disclosing aid spent to ensure relief or disaster act, introduced by Congressman Peters of California, Congressman Meadows of North Carolina. In 2018 alone, there were 14 natural disasters. Each resulted in more than $1 billion of losses. While insurance partially covers the cost of disaster recovery, the federal government, along with state, local, tribal, territorial partners, spending billions of dollars annually to respond to and recover from these events across more than 3 dozen departments and agencies. Unfortunately, clear and consolidated information regarding federal spending on disasters is unavailable. The Disaster Act would change that and require the Office of Management and Budget to annually compile, publicly release a report on disaster-related spending across the entire federal government. I urge members of the committee to support this common sense measure that will shed more light on how limited taxpayer resources are being spent. Doing so will help better inform how we prioritize the priorities in spending to drive down disaster-related expenditures in the future. I now recognize Subcommittee Chair Titus to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the bipartisan work that was done on H.R. 1984, the Disclosing Aid Spent to Ensure Relief, or Disaster Act, an appropriate acronym, I believe. It was introduced by Congressman Peters of California and our subcommittee's ranking member, Congressman Meadows of North Carolina. As you described, this bill would direct the Office of Management and Budget to compile, aggregate, and organize all federal disaster relief assistance information that it currently collects and put it into an annually produced, user-friendly, publicly available report. There were 14 natural disasters last year that each resulted in over $1 billion loss, and it's been estimated by a report that came out of the Congressional Budget Office last month entitled Expected Cost of Damage from Hurricane Winds and Storm-Related Flooding, that the federal government is facing unprecedented rising costs. It could be as much as $54 billion annually. This Disaster Act will help us have needed information, give us a better understanding of how we're currently spending taxpayer resources, and hopefully lead to better informed debates, policies, and spending decisions that can bend the cost curve downward. I think it's a good bill, and I encourage the members of this committee to support it, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As has been pointed out, H.R. 1984, the Disaster Act, it's bipartisan legislation. It's going to require federal agencies across the government to report how much they spend on these disasters. You'd think we would know how much we actually spend, but really all we get is only an estimate. This is going to help us get some real numbers, increase transparency to taxpayers, and it's going to help Congress, I believe, make some more informed decisions. So with that, I would urge support of this legislation and yield back the balance.
I thank the gentleman, and now I'd recognize Subcommittee Ranking Member Meadows for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership and obviously for the subcommittee chairman and her leadership as well. I'm pleased to co-sponsor H.R. 1984, the Disaster Act. Obviously, transparency and good data are critical to holding agencies accountable and ensuring that we have the right information to identify needs and reforms. And last year, Congress passed the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, which included critical reforms on mitigation to bend the cost curves down during disasters. But to a certain extent, we've been flying blind. We don't really, as Congressman Graves mentioned, we don't really have the proper information. We need those to have better estimates of where disaster spending should be allocated. We need to have comprehensive information rather than just a fragmented bit of information from here or there. And this is a way to address that particular issue. We must have an across the government accounting of disaster spending so that all agencies are obligated to report those numbers. And this will tell us how quickly the assistance is getting to the communities hit by disasters. And no one has been more critical in fighting for that than the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Graves. We have others here, Mr. Weber, and others, where we actually know that Congress has done its job. It has certainly approved the money that has gone to these areas, whether they be in Houston, Texas, or Louisiana, or North Carolina, Florida, or Georgia. And yet, agencies continue to sit on the money and it is not deployed. And quite frankly, this is a good government proposal. Congressman Rouser from North Carolina knows all too well because he's not only dealing with the current disaster, he's dealing with the deployment of dollars from the previous disaster, which are still sitting on the sideline in agencies, and we cannot allow this to continue. And so I want to thank the chairman, both chairmen for their leadership and the ranking member for his leadership, and certainly encourage all of my colleagues to support this piece of legislation. I yield back.
Okay, thank the gentleman. Recognize Representative Finkenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Congressman Peters for his leadership on this bipartisan bill. My district, Iowa 1, sits right on the Mississippi, and we know all too well the importance of federal disaster assistance. Last weekend, just south of my district in Davenport, they broke a quarter-century flooding record because of persistent rain and snowfall, and a levee failed, devastating the downtown. We're looking ahead right now at a wet spring where the Mississippi could crest even higher. This is after terrible flooding already swept through western Iowa, and I am 100% committed to doing everything I can, working across the aisle with my colleagues to make sure Iowa families and businesses get the assistance that they need to recover from these disasters and also prepare for the next ones. These disasters are getting more and more costly and more frequent, and it's important that the government keep a record of federal disaster spending, not just in terms of how much we're spending on the immediate response, but also on the longer-term recovery efforts and on pre-disaster mitigation. This bill will help us get a clearer, more comprehensive picture of the critical role that the federal government plays in disaster recovery and mitigation. It will also add transparency to federal disaster assistance so that my constituents can be confident that their taxpayer dollars are being spent wisely. I look forward to voting for the bill, and again, thank Congressman Peters for his leadership on this bipartisan act, and I yield back.
I thank gentlelady Representative Garrett Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, very briefly, I want to thank Mr. Peters, I want to thank Ms. Titus and my friend from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows. I think that you take a look at this bill, it really encapsulates the problem. There are 4.5 pages of this legislation dedicated to just simply listing the agencies that are involved in disaster recovery and trying to get an accounting for how much money they're spending. Mr. Chairman, you go back to Mr. Meadows' comments earlier about the deficit. You can just take the top disasters that we've had over the last few decades. We're approaching $1.7 trillion in disaster spending. Virtually all of it is deficit spending. Virtually all of it is declared emergencies. We have got to get a handle on where this money is going in trying to corral this federal response. We're not being responsive to disaster victims. We're not being responsive to taxpayers. This process is irresponsible. This legislation is very important for us to get a handle, to understand what's happening with disaster recovery response dollars, to see where agencies are tripping over each other, and as Mr. Meadows noted, importantly, making sure that these dollars are getting efficiently to disaster victims. Just yesterday in the Rules Committee, I testified on an amendment whereby funds were appropriated under the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. This became law on February 9th of last year. Billions of dollars in flood mitigation funds still sitting in the bank that haven't even issued the Federal Register notice. And look, I want to be clear, this has happened under all administrations. This process is flawed, and we're re-victimizing our disaster victims by the alphabet soup of disaster recovery agencies that are involved in this. We can do better, and our citizens deserve better. Yield back.
You're here. Any other members wish to be recognized? Hearing and seeing none. Are there any amendments to H.R. 1984? Seeing none, the question is on the adoption favorably reporting H.R. 1984 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and reported favorably to the House. We move on now to H.R. 2502, Transparency in Federal Buildings Projects Acts of 2019. I call up H.R. 2502, asking unanimous consent to discharge Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management for further consideration of H.R. 2502, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. Recognizing myself, H.R. 2502 is just a beginning of ways we're going to look at and hopefully improve the General Services Administration. This is a first minimal step. It would require publishing on its website all prospectuses for leasing, design, or construction activities. This is a good government bill, and I congratulate our colleague, Congressman Palmer, for introducing it. And I would now recognize the gentlelady from Nevada to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 2502, the Transparency in Federal Buildings Projects Act of 2019, as you said, was introduced by our colleague, Congressman Gary Palmer. It is the first in a series of GSA reforms that our subcommittee will be hearing. The bill simply requires the GSA to publish on its website all prospectuses for leasing, design, or construction activities, to update that information quarterly, and to maintain the information for no less than 10 years in a readable, accessible, and searchable format. The bill is designed to increase transparency and provide taxpayers with greater oversight of the GSA's practices when it comes to leasing, design, and construction for our federal agencies. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back.
With that, I recognize the Ranking Member Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank Mr. Palmer for introducing this bill. Republicans on this committee have been and will continue to be committed to ensuring transparency in GSA real estate projects, and we approve that we do approve under the Public Buildings Act. We've done this in recent years by creating a one-stop shop on the committee Republicans website with information about GSA, their prospectuses, status, and congressional approvals. However, given GSA's role in this process, GSA should be doing the very same thing with this important information. This bill requires them, obviously, to do that. And with that, I would urge support of H.R. 2502, and I yield back the balance.
I thank the gentleman for his statement. I recognize Subcommittee Ranking Member Meadows for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, I am in support of 2502, but I will yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, to talk about the merits of this particular bill.
I thank the gentleman. I thank Chairman DeFazio and Ranking Member Graves and Chairwoman Titus for their support of this bill, and I want to congratulate all of you on your leadership and an effort on transparency. H.R. 2502, the Transparency in Federal Buildings Project Act, is common sense legislation. It requires GSA to include on its website all project prospectuses submitted for approval and associated information, including our resolutions of approval. This is a simple action but can have significant impact on improving accountability and transparency. While GSA includes some information on its website, the information provided is limited. This bill will ensure taxpayers know what projects have been proposed, how much they cost, and which have been approved. In 2013, the committee began filling this void by posting on our website the GSA prospectuses, the approval resolutions, as well as the dates of approval. Since that time, the committee's website has become a critical resource for not only the public, the private sector, but also for federal agencies. However, to ensure continuity and to ensure that this information is regularly updated and maintained, this bill would place the responsibility in GSA, who is responsible for the space. As I said before, it's a common sense bill and a straightforward way to provide more transparency on the billions of dollars we spend on federal real estate. I urge support of this legislation. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his leadership on this issue. Are there other members who wish to be recognized on this legislation? Seeing and hearing none, are there any amendments to 2502? Seeing and hearing none, then we would move a question on adoption and favorably reporting H.R. 2502 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. And I think, okay, we will now consider 20 General Services Administration Capital Investment Leasing Program resolutions en bloc. Ask unanimous consent to call up the resolutions en bloc and that they be considered as read and open to amendment at any point without objection so ordered. I would recognize the subcommittee chair to explain the legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before you are 20 General Service Administration's resolutions. And I'd like to point out that I'm pleased they contain bipartisan language from the 115th Congress that prohibits elected officials from benefiting from federal leases. I also support the new language, which requires the GSA to consider environmental impacts when they are conducting lease procurements. I want to thank Ranking Member Meadows and the subcommittee staff for working to put this package of 20 together. Included in here are a lease for the FBI field office in Las Vegas, a lease for the Centers of Disease Control in Congressman Johnson's district in Georgia, and a lease for the Army Corps of Engineers in Congresswoman Napolitano's district in Los Angeles. I would like to inform my colleagues, however, of one specific lease that was intentionally not included in this markup, and I'd like to explain why in case there's any question. In January of 2018, GSA submitted to this committee a prospectus for a lease of up to 104,000 rentable square feet for the Department of Agriculture's National Institute of Food and Agriculture that's located here in Washington. However, in August of 2018, before this committee had considered that prospectus, USDA issued a request for expression of interest, RFEI, for potential sites to relocate NIFA and another agency, the Economic Research Service, out of our nation's capital. USDA issued the site selections process without a clear determination that the agency had any legal authority to conduct the procurement to move these two agencies. During a recent agriculture appropriations hearing on the FY20 budget, Chairman Bishop told USDA Secretary Perdue, "I still do not agree that this is a good decision. It doesn't make any sense, and it seems to be a solution in search of a problem." He continued, "How in any way does it make budget sense to move ERS and NIFA outside of DC where there is rent-free space here and it's available?" Because of that and other comments that have been made about some of the economists who are fleeing USDA because they believe their decisions have been targeted and that's why the buildings are being, or the agencies are being moved, I have a number of questions and concerns about how this process started, why it started, and how it will proceed. I'm not alone. You can see the story here if you haven't already read it. The Inspector General of USDA is also reviewing this process and examining some of the same questions that I raised. So we wonder, is this some kind of political retribution against the federal employees at this agency because they don't like their decisions? Maybe that's the case. It's just important that we have all the information in front of us. We need clear information about what their plans are, what's GSA's role, what's the timetable for any moves, and any supporting analysis so that we can perform our oversight responsibilities effectively. That would include any new leases, overstays of current leases, or any decisions that are related to these agencies. We want to be sure they're made in a transparent manner and are in the interest of the American people. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get these answers and we'll be able to proceed with the important work of this committee. But until that time, we're not moving that particular resolution forward. With that said, though, I do support the 20 that are before you today, and I urge passage of those. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady for her statement. Now recognize Ranking Member Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Subcommittee Chair Titus and the Ranking Member Meadows for their work on these resolutions, and you, of course, for continuing the bipartisan work on with GSA prospectuses. Ensuring leases are replaced and renewed on time is critical to avoiding costly penalties and maximizing opportunities for savings and good deals. And two of these leases that we're approving today are going to address critical space needs in my home state of Missouri. I look forward to continuing our tradition of reviewing and moving prospectuses on a regular basis, and I support approval of these resolutions, and I yield back the balance.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize Representative Palmer for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Chairwoman Titus and the Ranking Member Meadows for the work that they've done on approving these GSA prospectuses. Approving these resolutions to support improvements in space utilization, reduce costs, and facilitate consolidations in federal office space. Cumulative, these resolutions represent more than $138 million in savings to the taxpayers. Over the next 5 years, more than half of GSA's leases will expire. We need to get out ahead of this curve and help position GSA to get the best lease deals for the taxpayers. I look forward to continuing to work on a bipartisan basis so that we can avoid costly holdovers and short-term extensions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I urge my colleagues to approve these resolutions. I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Other members wish to be recognized. I understand Representative Norton wishes to be recognized. Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Ms. Titus for her remarks on the USDA and why it is not before this committee. It's unusual to have to state why a matter is not before this committee, but she was entirely, I think, right to bring to the attention of the committee an attempt by the administration to simply skirt this committee and skirt the Appropriation Committee and relocation of the USDA, Department of Agriculture, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, outside of the district, and we're not even sure to where. I've served on this committee for a long time, but never have I seen a matter proceed from an administration where there appears to be no legal authority to relocate an agency. There's no budget authority to relocate the agency, and the matter seems to be being proceeded and moved almost unilaterally by this administration. In last August, the Democratic members of the House Appropriations Committee wrote to the Secretary Perdue, expressing their concern, and they requested, therefore, more information about what the USDA was doing, and indeed including a statement in the FY 2019 appropriation bill that directed the USDA to provide cost estimates and a detailed analysis of any research benefits. There are costs to moving agencies. There could be benefits, but this committee and the Appropriation Committee seem to agree that that justification has to be presented to Congress before such a move can occur, and I thank Ms. Titus for bringing this to the full attention of the committee.
Thank you, gentlelady. Any other members wish to be recognized? Seeing none, then we will move the 20 GSA resolutions. Any amendments? No. Okay. If there are none, the question is now on adoption of 20 GSA resolutions en bloc. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed by saying nay. The ayes have it. 20 resolutions are approved. Closing, I ask unanimous consent that each bill reported today will be reported as single amendment in the nature of substitute incorporating any amendments adopted. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent staff be authorized to make all necessary technical, clarifying, conforming changes to each of the bills ordered reported today to reflect the actions of the committee. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 22, Clause 1, I ask unanimous consent the chair or his designee be authorized to offer such motions as be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the legislation adopted today or any similar measure. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that pursuant to Rule 9, Clause 2L, members have at least 2 calendar days in which to file any supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views of legislation adopted today. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman, after consultation with the ranking member, has authority to strike or revise any provision of the bills ordered reported today that would cause a sequential referral to another committee and that would cause the bills or concurrent resolutions to be subject to a Budget Act or Rule 21 pay-go point of order. Without objection, so order. Pursuant to Rule 5 of the Rules Committee on Transportation Infrastructure, chair notes presence of quorum for actions taken on all committee business today. With that, the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure has completed its business today, and the committee is adjourned.